Meshech Chochma for Parshas Tavo. We're going to study today, Mirza Hashem, two pieces in the Meshech Chochma. One is Perek Chav Ches, Pasuk Yudalid. And in order to sort of decipher almost a puzzle here in this presentation, we're going to have to look in the psukim inside. So if you have a chumash, you want to open up to Perek Chav Ches. And the next piece in Rab Meir Simcha that we'd like to study, B'li Neder, is Perek Chav Tes Pasuk Gimel. But we have a ways until we get to that. Now, Perek Chav Ches begins with the brachos. And as you know, that this parsha of Tavo is made up of both brachos and klolos. As far as the brachos are concerned, the introduction to the brachos in Pasuk Aleph of Perek Chav Ches is V'haya im shamoa tishma b'kol Hashem Elokecha l'shmor la'asos es kol mitzvosav asher anochi mitzavcha hayom. So God says that first I want to see if you will live up to your obligation and you will follow the mitzvahs meticulously. And then in Pasuk Beis Uba lecha kol habrachos ha'ela, you'll get all these brachos. And there's a whole list of brachos over here. Now, if you fast forward to Pasuk Yud Aleph, V'osircha Hashem l'tova, this is a special blessing. And I know that this is special because it says V'hosircha, which is the word, the shorish of the word is yeter. Yeter means this is an extra bracha. Now we're going to try to figure out what that extra bracha is all about. And this section, at the beginning of Perek Chav Ches, culminates and completes itself in Pasuk Yud Daled, which ends with a pei, which indicates that you've completed a section in the Torah. And it says, V'lo sasur mikol hadvarim asher anochi mitzaveh eschem hayom yaminu smol. Lo leches achrei Elohim achirim le'avdam. Now, if you take a look at Rab Meir Simcha, I'm going to start backwards, because so much of what Rab Meir Simcha is presenting is an answer to the Ramban's question. And he doesn't actually quote verbatim the question of the Ramban, but you see at the end of the paragraph, he writes, V'ayin divrei Ramban b'sefer mitzvah sof shoresh dal. Now, in the Ramban, in Shoresh Daled, the Ramban raises the following, or addresses the following question, and that is the last pasuk in this parsha, Lo Sasur, sounds like a lav, and perhaps therefore it should be counted amongst the Taryag mitzvos, as one of the Losa says. And in fact, the Ramban quotes the Bahag, the Baal Halachos Gedolos, who counts this as a lav. And the Torah is now telling us, Lo tasu mikol advarim asher anochi mitzavcha hayom, mitzaveschem hayom. And this is to be counted as one of the lavim in the Torah. The Ramban disagrees with the Baal Halachos Gedolos, and he insists that our pasuk should be connected to the pasuk right before it. And if you look at the end of Pasuk Yud Gimel, the Torah says, Ki tishma el mitzvos Hashem Elokecha. And Pasuk Yud Gimel, if you will fulfill the will of God and be careful about fulfilling and observing His mitzvos, then we add to that v'lo tasur, and you will not deviate from all that God commanded you. And then you deserve all the brachos that are mentioned here, included in this parsha. So to summarize, Rameir Simcha is quoting a Ramban in Sefer Mitzvahs, and in the Shroshim, which is the first half of the book of Sefer Mitzvahs, very often the Ramban will comment on the Bahag, the Baal Halachas Gedolos, because amongst the Monia Mitzvahs, the Rishonim that counted and enumerated the 613, one of the major and original Rishonim was the Baal Halachas Gedolos. The Ramban takes the opportunity in his critique of the Rambam in Sefer Mitzvahs to talk sometimes about the Baal Halachas Gedolos. Here's an example. And the Ramban says he disagrees with the Baal Halachas Gedolos, who counts Lo Sosur here as one of the Losas. And he says, no, it's not a Losas at all. It's part of the divine promise to present and to bestow upon Klal Yisrael all the different brachos that are enumerated here at the beginning of Perek Ches, but they're all conditional on number one, as we saw at the end of Pasuk Yud Gimel, Ki Tishma El Mitzvos Hashem Elokecha, and number two, Lo Tasu Mikol Advarim, and we should not deviate from anything that God commanded us. So we have in some two different ways of understanding Lo Sasur. One is that it's part of the condition, the conditions that God sets forward. We call it in Hebrew a T'nai. And all the brachos now are conditional on this T'nai of Lo Tasur. And that's the Ramban's critique of the Bahag, who counts this as a Lo Taseh in the Torah. The Ramban strongly disagrees with including this Lo Tasur as one of the Lavim, because this is an integral part of the Parsha of the Brachos, and in fact, this is the condition in order for us as Klal Yisrael to be Zoche, to merit all these wonderful blessings that are bestowed upon us, promised us. We have to first make sure that Ki Tishma Mitzvos Hashem Elokecha Lo Tasur Mikol Advarim Asher Anochi Mitzaveh Eschem Hayom. Now, I say this all as an introduction to this presentation of Rameir Simcha. And even though all I've done for you so far is I've only read one line, which is the last concluding line in this presentation. But I think now, in light of this background information, this introduction, we can go back to the beginning of Rameir Simcha and put the pieces of the puzzle together. As I said, this piece in Rameir Simcha, like the second piece that I chose for today, is a puzzle. And Rameir Simcha assumes that we're all geniuses and we can figure out this puzzle. We go back to the beginning of Rameir Simcha. Now you'll notice in this paragraph, Rameir Simcha quotes a Gemara in Baba Basra, and he follows with a Gemara in Erchin. So those are the two Gemaras that he quotes. And in truth, I have to tell you that the Gemara that he quotes from Meshech Erchin is really a Gemara that appears in many places, or at least I would say a statement in Chazal that appears in many places. It's a Gemara in Sanhedrin, it's also Bava Kama, it's also Medrash Rabbah, in Shir Hashirim. And in all these sources, unanimously, Chazal say that there was a prayer, and we'll see soon who actually offered this prayer, to be Mavatel, the Yetzer Hara, the evil inclination for Avodah Zarah. And the Chazal imply that the only reason we're able to overcome this tremendous temptation to worship idols is because of this tefillah, this great prayer that was accepted on high to be Mavatel the Yetzer for Avodah Zarah. Otherwise, it would be too powerful of a Yetzer Hara. And Rameir Simcha quotes the Gemara in Erchin, and the Gemara identifies who are those who pray in order to spare us from this impossible challenge of the Yetzer of Avodah Zarah. And the Gemara identifies that prayer as the prayer of the Anshe Knesses HaGadol. The Gemara doesn't stop there, The Gemara goes on to ask why Moshe Rabbeinu didn't offer this prayer way before the Anshe Knesset Gadol, why Yoshua didn't offer the prayer. And the Gemara says, Bishlema Moshe, I can justify why Moshe didn't offer this prayer. The entire project of praying to destroy and undermine the Yetzer Hara for Avodah Zarah is limited to Eretz Yisrael. Only in Eretz Yisrael do we have the power of prayer to nullify the Yetzer Hara for Avodah Zarah. Moshe Rabbeinu never made it into Eretz Yisrael. He didn't have the schus of Eretz Yisrael. Therefore, it was impossible for him to pray. But next on the line, I call it on the firing line, is Yoshua. The Gemara wants to know, why didn't Yoshua pray to destroy and undermine the Yetzer Hara for Avodah Zarah? And the Gemara says that this is a critique against Yoshua. The Gemara offers no defense, and this is a failing of Yoshua. And Yoshua left it for a later generation, and it wasn't until the Anshe Knesset Gdola. In the meantime, there was a tremendous amount of idol worship that unfortunately penetrated into the very fabric of the community of Israel. Now, why is Reb Meir Simcha in this particular context, when the Torah is telling us that if we observe the will of God and all the mitzvahs meticulously and we don't deviate, we will be blessed with the entire list of blessings here? Why in this context is Reb Meir Simcha interested in this entire episode of prayer to undermine the Yetzer Hara for Avodah Zarah? It seems at the face of it totally irrelevant, and I worked very hard to try to figure out where Reb Meir Simcha is trying to take us. Reb Meir Simcha begins by quoting a Gemara in Baba Basra. The Gemara Baba Basra, Bo Re'eh Shalom Kemidas HaKadosh Baruch Hu Midas Basar V'Dam. The Gemara is contrasting the attributes of HaKadosh Baruch Hu with those of flesh and blood. HaKadosh Baruch Hu birech es Yisrael bi-esrim u'shtayim v'kilalon b'shmona. When HaKadosh Baruch Hu blesses Klal Yisrael, he does so with all 22 letters of the alphabet, of the Aleph base, but he curses them with only 8 letters. Ve'ilu Moshe Rabbeinu birchan b'shmona. Moshe Rabbeinu is just the opposite. He blesses the people of Israel with 8 letters of the 22, and only 8 letters, but he curses them with all 22 letters. And the Gemara explains, from whence do we derive this conclusion? Birchan b'shmona mivahaya im shamoa tishma v'adla of dam. Now, once again, let's take out our chumash and figure out what led the Gemara to the conclusion that Moshe Rabbeinu only utilized 8 letters to bless the people of Israel. The parsha of the blessings, Perek Chav Ches in Sefer Dvarim, opens with the word v'haya. V'hayim shamoa tishma b'kol Hashem Elokecha. And the first letter is a vav. This parsha of the brachos ends in Pasuk Yud Daled, which ends with the word le'av dam. So you want to underline the mem of le'av dam. So it opens with a vav and concludes with a mem. From vav to mem is 8 letters, because you have vav to yud, and then you have chaf lamed mem. So if we count vav and we count mem, we're left with 8 letters. So the bracha, the entire parsha, made up of 14 psukim, opens with a vav, closes with a mem. Those are the 8 letters that Moshe Rabbeinu uses to bless the people of Israel. And then Ilulon be Esrim V'Shtayim. So now we have to see the next parsha, which begins with Pasuk Tesvav. And Pasuk Tesvav again opens up the Hayah, but in this case in Lo Tishma V'Kol Hashem, again with the letter Vav. And it concludes with the words Ad V'Ein Koneh. So for that you have to turn a couple of pages here in the Chumash, because we have a long Tochacha here. And that Klola ends in Pasuk Samach Ches. And again, you'll see a stuma. That's where the Torah ends the parsha. And it ends with the letter Hey. So you go from Vav to Hey. You make the entire sweep, the circle around the 22 letters of the Aleph Beis. And you end up with a Klola in which Moshe Rabbeinu begins with a Vav, ends with a Hey, and he utilizes all 22 letters. So Moshe Rabbeinu, whose Basar V'Dam in this context, is the exact opposite of Midas HaKodesh Baruch Hu. God's chesed is that he's going to bless Klal Yisrael with a full 22 letters. The curse is only going to be 8 letters. Moshe Rabbeinu, the opposite, he blesses Klal Yisrael with 8 letters and curses with all 22 letters. The Ramban says, Itamua, I don't understand. Fazet Tnai Lebracha. Tnai Abracha, Ki Tishma V'lo Tasu. Rabosai, that line in Rabbi Simcha would make no sense whatsoever unless we read the last line in this paragraph and the introduction that we gave and the Ramban's critique of the Mahag. Namely, how could the Mahag count Lo Sasur as one of the Lavim when Lo Sasur is just a Tnai? It's a precondition to all these brachos. V'tamua, says Rabbi Simcha, I cannot justify the Ramban. Because you see clearly that the Gemara counts this last pasuk, pasuk Yud Daled, that ends with the words Le'avdeim, with the word Le'avdeim, as part of the bracha itself. Otherwise, if it's just a T'nai, then it's not an integral part of the bracha. It cannot be included in the calculation of 8 letters. And you know, it's a brilliant question, Rabbi Simcha, but you can rack your brains until you figure out what he's asking. You have to really put the pieces of the puzzle together. How could the Ramban say that Lo Tasu, as a continuation of the previous pasuk of Ki Tishma El Mitzvah Hashem Elokecha, is a T'nai, and therefore T'nai is not an integral part of the bracha itself, it's just a precondition, right? So for example, if I enter into a transaction with you, I have a condition, you have to fulfill the condition, and then the transaction becomes valid. If God bestows brachos, God says to the people of Israel, first, I want to see you fulfill the conditions of Shema, Tishma, and Lo Tasur, and then I'm ready to bestow upon you the brachos. That's how the Ramban understood this parsha. Says Rabbi Simcha Tomua, the Gemara, in Meshech Baba Basra assumes that this last pasuk of Lo Tasur that ends with the word Le'avdeim is an integral part of the bracha. In fact, how does the Gemara know that Moshe Rabbeinu's bracha consisted of only 8 letters by quoting this last mem at the end of pasuk Yud Daled? So we open up with V'hayim Chamoah, which is a vav, and we end up with the mem, and you have a distance of 8 letters. That's part of the bracha itself. I find this very lumbish because if those of you who are a little bit oriented in lumbus, you know we always differentiate between a T'nai and the Gufa Maisa, or the T'nai and the Kiyum, or the Kinyan itself. And the Ramban clearly understood that this Lo Sasur is just a T'nai. I'll quote to you the words of the Ramban himself that Rameir Simcha refers to at the end of this presentation. The Ramban says, Aspal halachas gedolos belavdil otosu mikol dvarim asher anochi nitzavcha yom yeminu small he lav al kol mitzvahs Torah. It's a generic lav, not to violate any of the mitzvahs of the Torah. And he says, Nira li she'ein zel lav. It's only a part of the avtocha for the brachos. And the bracha says, "Unisancha Hashem l'rosh v'lo l'zanav," which pasuk is that? You'll see it inside there. What number is that? Okay, I'm not going to spend time on that. And it says, "Raka yisol amala," and then it says, "Chochma" in pasuk Yud Gimel. Oh, there it is. It's all in pasuk Yud Gimel actually. Unisanach Hashem l'rosh v'lo l'zanav v'yisa rak l'mala. Ki tishma. Ki tishma. The word ki means if you will observe the Torah. That's how the Ramban learns it. L'shmar v'lasos l'otos mikol advarim. Yomar ki yisbarach b'chol habrachos. That God may be blessed in all the great rewards that He promises us. Be also shomea. When we are shomea lasos ha-mitzvahs v'lo sosu mikol advarim, then we deserve the brachos. How could the Gemara in Baba Basra consider this as an integral part of the bracha itself, when in fact, according to the Ramban, it's only a Tanah? And therefore, Rabbi Simcha takes it upon himself, imagine the chutzpah, to disagree with both the Bahag and the Ramban. And this last pasuk that ends with the word Savdeim, Lavdam, is actually an integral part of the bracha itself. It's not a lav on all the mitzvahs HaTorah, as the Bahag would have it. It's not a t'nai, a precondition in all the brachos, as the Ramban would have it, but rather it's an integral part of the bracha. And he writes, "V'nira barur." Have you ever seen that language in Rameir Simcha? He always says yitachin. Nira barur. He's absolutely convinced. It's a blessing. What's the divine blessing of it? Al bitul avodah zara. Dahainu al yitzra d'avodah zara. Moshe Rabbeinu is promising the people another bracha. Not only will be your rush and you won't be lizanav, and not only will you multiply, and what else? You'll be lamala, not lamata. God promises the people of Israel that at some point there will be a bittul of avodah zarah, which means a bittul of the yetzer for avodah zarah. And now we understand, says Rabbi Simcha, pasuk Yud Aleph. Remember what I mentioned before, that pasuk Yud Aleph says, "V'hosircha Hashem l'tova." And that word indicates that there's going to be an extra surplus bracha. And where is that surplus bracha going to take place? If you look carefully at pasuk Yud Aleph, it says, "Al Adom asher nishba Hashem Elokecha lo seisla." Where are we going to have the ability through our prayers to destroy the Yetzer Hara for avodah zarah? It's going to be Al Adoma asher nishba Hashem Elokecha l'avosecha. In Eretz Yisrael, there's an amazing power of tefillah, and it reaches its apex when the Anshe Knesset Gdola in the land of Israel are able to pray and bring about the fulfillment of a divine promise that's incorporated into this parsha in Tavo of Lo Sasur Mikol Advarim Hanochi. How does the Ramban read the pasuk Lo Sasur Mikol Advarim Asher Anochi Mitzav Eschem? He reads it that you know why you're not going to deviate from the path. And because I promise you, you will have no Yetzer Hara to do so. And that's where Amir Simcha quotes the Gemara in Masechta Erchin Daf Lamed Beis that says that this bracha of Osircha Hashem al Adama, and that means that Lo Sasa, because you will never be tempted by Avodah Zarah, you'll be free of the shackles and the pressures of the Yetzer Avodah Zarah, and that's going to be fulfilled in the land of Israel. And the Gemara says that this refers to Anshe Knesset Gdola. They were the ones who brought about the promise, the divine bracha, to bring it to fruition. And the Gemara again says that Moshe Rabbeinu could not have possibly have brought about this change, this destruction of an undermining of the Avodah Zarah Yetzer, because he didn't have the schus of Eretz Yisrael. Yoshua, on the other hand, is taken to task and criticized. The critique is that Yoshua should have brought about the destruction of the Yetzer Hara of Avodah Zarah because he had the schus of Eretz Yisrael. He could have prayed, and he could have brought about the fulfillment of Osircha Hashem Litova Al Hadom Asher Nishba Hashem Elokecha Lavosechel Eseslach Lo Sasur Mikol Advarim Ha'ele Lo Leches Akrei Elohim Achirim Le'ovda. So I just want to make a few comments here before we go on to the next piece. Number one, the chutzpah, if you pardon the phrase, I don't mean it pejoratively, I mean it actually as a positive compliment, that Reb Meir Simcha will disagree with two of the great Rishonim, the Bahag and the Ramban, as to how to interpret a pasuk. Number two, the greatness of Reb Meir Simcha is that he saw a Gemara in Baba Basra, which is an agadita about how many letters Moshe Rabbeinu utilized in bestowing the bracha, transmitting the bracha to Klal Yisrael, and he saw that this word, which ends with a mem at the end of Pasuk Yudal, was part of the bracha, and that gave him the places, as we call it, the shoulders, the chutzpah, to disagree with the Ramban, because the Ramban says that this Pasuk of Sasur is a T'nai. Nain, it's not a T'nai. It's an integral part of the bracha. And HaKadosh Baruch Hu promises that the day will come when the Yetzer Hara, that powerful, alluring inclination, evil inclination to worship idols against something that we're not familiar with, it's totally foreign to us because we live in the post-Anshe Knesset Gdola period. God already promises that the day will come when there will be no Yetzer Hara for Avodah Zarah. And that day will come when there'll be a prayer that has the schus of Eretz Yisrael, and that prayer in Eretz Yisrael is going to come from the mouths of the Anshe Knesset Gdola, and Reb Meir Simcha is great because what he does is, not only does he reinterpret the pasuk of Sasur in a brand new way, changing our whole understanding of this pasuk, now it becomes an integral part of the bracha. God is promising the destruction, the undermining of the Yetzer of Avodah Zarah, but moreover, he radically connects this pasuk to Vosircha, shedding a whole new light on Vosircha, Adom Asher Nasati Lavosecha, that in Eretz Yisrael, HaKadosh Baruch Hu promises that the Kedusha of Eretz Yisrael, perhaps the Tefillah in Eretz Yisrael, perhaps the Kiyum HaMitzvahs in Eretz Yisrael, that power of Kedushas Eretz Yisrael will be so intense that it will bring about the undermining, to expunge and undermine the entire enterprise, that sinister enterprise of the Yetzer Hara for Avodah Zarah. Okay, I'm just going to take a moment to press a mute button here if I can. Oh, okay, fine. All right. So that's Hakofa Aleph. And now we're up to Hakofa Beis. If you can fast forward now, the Perikov test, Pasuk Gimel.
30 לעמדה אחת.
I need someone here to unmute themselves, or on the contrary, to mute themselves. Okay, if you can. So let's open up to Perek Chavtes and see what goes on in Perek Chavtes. Vayikra Moshe el kol adas Yisrael v'yom aleim atem risem es kol asher asa Hashem leinechem b'eretz Mitzrayim lefaro l'chol avodav l'chol artzo hamasos hagdolos asher ro einecha hosos v'amofsim hagdolim hahem. And if I would ask you, what is the thesis or the motif of remembering that which happened to you and you saw with your eyes in Eretz Mitzrayim. And anybody give me an answer that has one word, two letters? Nes. It's all about miracles. It's about Amasos HaGedolos. It's about the Osos, the Mosim. And there's so many different miracles that we can talk about, because after Yetzias Mitzrayim and Yam Suf, so we have all the miracles of Mitzrayim, then we have the miracles of the Midbar for 40 years, the Man and the Be'er and the Anani HaKavod, etc., etc. Now we get to Pasuk Gimel. V'lo nasan Hashem lachem lev ladas ve'inayim l'ros v'aznayim l'shma ad hayom hazeh. Very strange pasuk. And Moshe Rabbeinu is saying that today something is going on. Something is happening today that is going to give the people of Israel lev ladas, etc., etc. Olicheschem arba'im shana b'midbar, lo bolu samlo sechem alechem, etc. It says alechem lo achaltem, and it's very strange. The thesis and the theme of this entire section of the Torah is the great miracles, supernatural events that Bnei Yisrael saw with their eyes during Yetzias Mitzrayim. They experienced for 40 years in the Midbar, and right in the middle of this presentation, Moshe Rabbeinu adds Ad Hayom Hazeh. Something happened today, and that, so to speak, gives you a perspective, a new perspective, Lev Ladas, on all the great miracles that undermine the laws of nature that took place both in the Parsha of Yetzias Mitzrayim and the Parsha of 40 years in the Midbar. Says Rabbi Simcha, Ha'inyan, what is this Ad Hayom Hazeh? What's taking place on this day? Hibiarti b'kama makomos. And Rabosa, I'm proud to say that this is something that's so familiar to us from learning the Meshech Chochma, because we've seen more than once that Rabbi Simcha dwells on a theory and repeats this theory over and over again. And that is that Moshe Rabbeinu, as the agent of bringing about all these miracles, was very confusing for the people of Israel. Why? They understood that Moshe Rabbeinu is much more than just a conveyor to transmit the word of God. He is godlike. He is divine in his own being, such that he is actively bringing about these miracles. That was the thesis of Rabbi Simcha, that the chashash, that there was a tremendous fear, and there was room for that fear over and over again, that Klal Yisrael would attribute a lot of these miracles to Moshe Rabbeinu, and Moshe Rabbeinu was actually not just an agent of God, in which the voice and the arm of God was bringing about the miracles, that Moshe Rabbeinu, we can attribute the miracles to Moshe and his car. Asher tos b'nei Yisrael b'kama makomos haya ki chashvu leMoshe lepoel me'atzmo. And Rabosa, you may recall that in the past, Rabbi Simcha used to quote the Rambam at the beginning of Hilchas Akum, where the Rambam explains how